I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to the Monday edition of The Conversation with Al McFarlane. Today, we call it Governance at the Neighborhood Level. And the idea is that I get together with friends and partners of mine in building community, particularly my friends and colleagues over at Hawthorne Neighborhood Council. Diana Hawkins is here and Dee Phillips is here. They are principals, staff, and directors of the historic Hawthorne Neighborhood Council. And who's also with me today is my co-writing friend and partner, Brenda Lyle-Gray. Brenda, how are you doing?
I'm fine.
Dee, how are you? Diana, how are you?
Good, thank you. How are you?
Fine,
I'm
Al.
doing
How
really
are
well.
you?
I had a good weekend so far. So I'll hang on to it as long as I can. Diana, how was your weekend?
It was pretty good. It was quiet. I tried to ignore all the gunfire that was happening. This is getting really ridiculous, but you can't. So but other than that, it was good. I got to make my plug. We're still collecting backpacks, you guys. So please email me dHawkins@hnc.mpls.org. We really want our babies to have backpacks full. We got a nice donation today. Someone came and gave us almost about 100 binders, 3-ring binders. So we're going to be putting those in the backpacks. And then on September 10th, that's the giveaway. And you can also get vaccinated. You can get lead tested. You can get your glucose checked. You can get your blood pressure checked. I don't think I forgot anything, did I, Dee?
No, it sounds pretty fully. Yeah, I think you got it all.
Okay, so that's my pitch for today.
There we go. Well, thank you both very much. Let me bring in our special guest today for the first part of the program. Julie Blaha is Minnesota State Auditor. She's running for re-election. She is serving her first term in that position. And Julie, I think that the auditor is kind of the least known, but perhaps the most important position in the executive panel. Before we started, we were reminiscing on your predecessors, and who popped to mind immediately to me were people like Arnie Carlson, people like Mark Dayton, both of whom, Arnie, Mark, and is it Reichgott? Was she an auditor? No.
No, Amber Reichgott, I believe she ran for treasurer. And that's always the trick, is since we don't have a treasurer, it does change a bit the whole dynamic of that. But yes, we had one auditor who was both the auditor and the treasurer, Mattson, who was the last person who had served in both positions at one point or another.
Well, let's start by, first of all, welcoming you and thanking you for your service, your leadership. Take the time to give us Auditor 101. Because I think it's always useful to hear from the practitioner what the scope of the work is. And the nature of your work, you are an independent officer in the state. You're not hired by the governor. You don't report to the governor. You report to the people of Minnesota, I think. Explain that for me. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. I cut out just a little bit, but I think I know what you're asking. If you're not sure what your state auditor does, don't feel bad. In Minnesota is different than every other state. Every state is a little different in how they handle the auditor. In Minnesota, I oversee about $60 billion in government spending. Now, most of that is at the local level. We do it in 3 main ways. We do it with examinations like audits and investigations. We also provide direct support to people in local government, training, tools, things like that. And then we also collect and disseminate data. So our job is to give you analysis. Take all this information, give it back to you so you can make a decision based on facts. So the key things are 60 billion, examinations, support, and analysis. And I think it's one thing what we do is interesting, particularly people like me, but why we do it is what really matters. Ultimately, when you are working with local government, the whole point of oversight is so that we can protect our freedom to make decisions in community. When local government works, that gives us the structure to come together as neighbors. And so the people who are closest to an issue get to be the people who are leading on the solutions. And I think we all know that if it's the people who are most directly involved that have the best ideas. And so if we can keep the trust, if we can reduce waste and abuse, if we can make sure that people are following the rules, you're going to end up with a situation where local people get to make local change. And that's what I'm most excited about in this role.
Julie, take a minute to explain your background, why you sought this office. This was your first public office, I believe.
Right. Now, I think, I don't think too many little girls grow up, dreaming of being the state auditor. But I'll tell you, the first time I thought about this was in some capacity, was when my mom became the first woman to ever serve on a committee in Burns Township. And now Burns Township is up here in northern Anoka County. It's now the bustling metropolis of now then. But back then, my mom decided we need to get our roads paved. She was sick of the dust. She was sick of all of that. And so she got herself appointed to the Road and Bridge Committee. In fact, at that point, we didn't even have any bridges, but we were ready. So she gets herself appointed to that. And then by working together with the financial people there, with her neighbors, our roads got paved and our neighbors' roads got paved. And what I saw, this was as a 12-year-old, I saw that now Mr. Lane could sit on his porch. He was on oxygen and he couldn't sit out before that road was paved.
Dust. Too much dust, yeah.
Exactly. My friend down the street, she could ride bikes with us again, and who had asthma. And so I started to see that this really, really makes a difference, that local work can do something that affects you every day. And so every time I've been involved in politics in some capacity, I've always gravitated local. I was an educator, taught middle school math. And if you're in the classroom and you want to support your students, you see that everything in your classroom goes through a political process. So the only way to truly support your students fully is to be engaged in that process. So I started to understand more about school finance, started working with my union. I became a union president and eventually the treasurer of the Minnesota AFL-CIO, first woman to serve in that role. And there I worked on things like pensions. I also saw how you take a budget and match it to your values. They always say that, if you want to find out what somebody's values are, look at their budget.
Yeah.
Look at their budget. It tells you everything you need to know. And
follow the money.
Exactly. And that's the same thing in government too. If we can match our resources, if our resources follow our values, good things happen. But we need good oversight for that, and we need good support for that. We need good analysis for that. And so that was my role. So, and like so many women who run for office, people said, this really is the kind of job that fits you. And you're into this, you understand pensions, you understand school finance and other levels of finance and local government. And you've been on your local economic development authority. You're really into this. So naturally, I heard all that and said, no way, like most women do. And, they say it takes us, 7 asks before we decide to run for office. And it really did take that for me. But now that I've been doing it, it's just a wonderful opportunity. I get to be with people at the very kind of birth of a good idea. This is where so many of our ideas get their first proving ground, is in local government. Things like, for instance, minimum wage. It's not getting through at the federal level yet, stuck at the state level. Well, you know what? Then we can do it city by city. Look at things like rent control. We do that. We're doing that locally. A lot of our housing solutions are local solutions. And if they get a fair shot in the local level, then we can find out what can be replicated and spread across the state. So it's very important we protect this level. Not just for the day-to-day work they do to keep the roads together, keep the schools going, keep the hospitals together, but it's a place where we can build new ideas that solve real problems. So I'd say that, again, all these other roles that you have people on here, they're great, but hey, local's where the action is. I feel like I get the very best job in government right now.
My sense of the auditor is that the auditor's office is like the watchdog, kind of watching the state's money, the taxpayers' money. And what authority then is vested in your office, in your position on behalf of the people of Minnesota?
Well, that is, I think, that's the most interesting discussion about what we do. I think a lot of people who run for this job, including my opponents, they run for this role thinking they get to tell people what to do. They're gonna grab a spreadsheet and use that spreadsheet to tell you what your solution should be. That is absolutely not the role of the auditor. The auditor is to give you facts. The auditor is to help you keep your promises. The auditor is to give you tools to be successful, and the auditor is to give you there to give you feedback. But you are the person. You are the people that have the ideas. So it's really important that we are giving you honest, fair data. And we are holding you to standards and laws, but we're not going in and simply trying to impose our own will. I see that all the time where an auditor, for instance, I have kind of a MAGA Republican opponent, and he looked at Southwest Light Rail, didn't like the decision, and said he should just tell them what to do. You don't get to do that. You can tell them you have a problem and you need to solve it, but you have to trust the people in community to solve it. If you want to be the person who solves it, then you want to be a county commissioner. You want to be a legislator. You want to be a governor. Your job is to, again, shine the light on what is working and what's not working. Now, if you talk about what's not working most of the time, you get a lot of headlines, and we've had to do that. We've had to call people out so people understand problems. But you also have to be just as ready to tell people, say, when things are working. For instance, during COVID, it was one of the first times I can remember that the federal government really looked to local government to help solve an economic crisis. More money went to local government levels than had gone there in the past. And as a result, they were able to customize it for their communities. And they did this in record time with record complexity while the cat's walking across the keyboard because they had to do it from their basement. And you know what? Local government kept us out of economic free fall during the pandemic. And they really are owed a debt of gratitude. And we need to find a way to make sure that we are ready to use local government again, even if we're going to respond to global issues. So again, authority is about helping you keep your promises, making sure that what you want happens. And that's it. And you've got to be very careful for auditors who want to go further and impose their own political agenda. You have to protect your office from that. That's a big part of my work.
And so how do you help me keep my promise? How do you help business and organizations and agencies keep their promise? And that's what I'm trying to get at. What is the regulatory authority that you operate under and with?
So if you are, we have the authority to go in and examine anything we need to examine in the public interest. If there's a public interest for us to go in and examine, we can do that. Our best examinations, I believe, are our audits. Mainly because they're preventative. I think a lot of us, we think of audit, we think of punishment, right? We think of punishment, or we think of it as investigation, right? Their best use is preventative, is to get ahead to make sure you've got the processes in order to avoid problems in the first place. So that's I think our first most important work, is to ensure that you are taking the steps to prevent problems in the first place. After that, if we catch a problem, then we can go in and say, you need to do this. There are in some cases where we say, hey, you're not reporting. You no longer have access to certain funds. We turn things over to county attorneys or the attorney general if there needs to be legal action. We also support law enforcement investigating financial crime as well when it comes to local government. So that is our level of authority. But I got the authority matters, but the preventative work, I would say, is even more important. And it doesn't get nearly the attention that I wish it did.
You talked about being a teacher and a wonderful story about your mom's experience in organizing to improve the breathability of your community. Tell me more about your growing up, your background, and your pathway to all those stellar achievements that you have accomplished. Quite impressive. Along the way, who was 5-year-old Julie? Who was 7-year-old Julie? And, I love the fact that you said that at one level, young girls are not encouraged to dream about, being elected to a state office, and a big one like that in particular. So. Well,
I have to say, when I grew up, one of the things I was really lucky is that I had this great family that gave me every opportunity they could give us. We didn't have a lot of money growing up. My dad started his own machine shop, and there were times, those Christmases we had to have that discussion about There may not be presidents this year. There were times when we knew that if the shop failed, we'd lose the house. And at 14 years old, I started as I was a machine operator, a lathe operator. I was a machinist as a kid. And so that was what we did. Family business, you get downstairs. Other kids, when they had a snow day, they were all excited. My first thought was, brass parts. Because the shop was connected to our house. We could just go downstairs, we're making parts, right? And so I have to say, I didn't always appreciate it as a kid. In fact, I prayed for a sexist father every day of my childhood. People come into the shop and say, oh my gosh, should you have your girls doing this? And my sister and I are like, yeah, Dad, delicate flowers here. I don't know. And what I did, but what helped me learn so much was seeing what it's like to put everything you've got into your business and not just for you, but also for your whole community, and what it's like for those people who take those risks for small businesses. So eventually I had a chance to serve on an economic development authority in my community. And it was because they knew I'd grown up my dad's machine shop in a small business trying to make it. I also remember growing up in a situation where my father, who was a brilliant machinist, one of the best literally in the world. But because he went to trade school, because he was broke, because he had a beard, because we lived out in the sticks, I remember so many conversations he had with engineers who didn't take him seriously. Here's an engineer who's never changed his own oil in his car, but my dad, he can't take serious because my dad didn't go to college. My dad didn't have a lot of money. And I'll tell you, that is something that has served me so well in this role, because so many people who come to local government are not coming from these very traditional, they're not all lawyers with a minor in poli-sci, right? That's not where they're coming from. These are regular people. And when I saw the work that my mom could do on that township board, the work that my dad did for NASA, I could see that I believe that everybody in Minnesota, everybody who has the ability to vote, has the ability to make $1 billion decision. And we can't let anybody tell you otherwise. There's such pressure to make people feel like they can't understand something, or they're not smart enough, or they're not connected enough, or not experienced enough. And we know that biases like that particularly disenfranchise people of color in Minnesota, Indigenous people, women in Minnesota, the LGBTQ community, disability community, everybody we absolutely need involved in the process. So part of my role is also to make sure that we are supporting those brand new local government officials, so they know that their good ideas get a fair shot and they actually get to see the light of day, because too often the people that are in local government, their ideas are devalued. So that's a big part of that. My childhood really brings me to that place.
Well, that's a wonderful place to come from, I believe. I think I really value and appreciate the critique. I think that what I'm hearing you say is that, in a sense, in a way that's both structural and almost mindless, we all participate in the devaluation of each other's capability, of our ability, and then we use a cultural, institutional shorthand to assign limits to what people can do, and the assigners, and we participate in that as citizens, are people somehow regarded as more intelligent, more wealthy, more educated, more something, and you are protesting that. You're saying that your experience is that you've seen that if a person can vote, a person can vote on $1 billion decision, and that be a good vote. That's what I hear you saying. Am I getting that right?
Oh, absolutely. You know, one of the things when I say that I'm a champion for local control, the way I have to fight for it. One example would be fire relief associations handle the pensions of volunteer firefighters in Minnesota. Now, here are people we trust to drag us out of a burning building, but yet there are people that want to take away their decisions about their pension. In Minnesota, they can decide where they invest that, as long as the investments are keeping up with the obligations of the pensions, right? There are people that were looking at those in retrospect saying, oh, I think I could have done a better job. I have a financial background. I could have done a better job with that. So I want to take away their choice and move it to and just saying that the State Board of Investment should just invest it. They should have no choices in that. And of course, these are firefighters coming back saying, you know what? I know we know what we're doing, and we're looking at this wider. Now, the person who was bringing this up, the legislator that brought it up, he wasn't necessarily wrong in the things he said as much as he was narrow. He wasn't looking at the entire picture because he wasn't on the ground. Firefighters are saying, yes, we have to look at returns, but we also have to look at support. We have a day job, and then we volunteer as a firefighter. So we need somebody who could provide a wider level of support. So we would take a slight dip in return if we can get more support. Now, again, you're going to hear that from somebody on the ground, but people are often looking at these firefighters saying, oh, well, you don't have a college degree. You don't understand money the way I do. You don't have the kind of degree that I have. Therefore, I'm going to tell you what to do to save you. We don't need as many knights in shining armor as we need people who have your back. That's what we really need. And we don't need people. You have to talk to people on the ground. And when we talk about that, I think that's something that binds rural and urban Minnesota too. When they talk about the rural-urban divide, if you ask people, hey, do people let you make decisions in your own community? Everybody's on the same page on that. Again, in greater Minnesota, it's a different discussion than it can be sometimes in Minneapolis or in St. Paul, but it's the same flavor. I mean, it's the same type of discussion. And so I think that if we look at local control as the idea of people in community getting to actually own their own future, that's something that brings people together all across the state.
Everything has its ups and downs, pros and cons. Many things are at the same time both good and a double-edged sword. So two things come to mind as you describe this to me, Julie. One is that in my experience as an African American, the notion in our country of local control has been a euphemism for white supremacist control in the South generally, broadly, historically, but also in the emerging diverse communities in northern metropolis areas as well. And in that regard, ethnic or Black or people of color have found themselves often kept at the margin for the sake of the old boys network, the old club, right? And so as demographics shift, things must shift. And so I hear two things happening. One is acknowledging the importance of local decision making, but also there's a need to make sure that that is not formulaic or a process that marginalizes part of the base. What do you think about that?
Oh, that is very, very well said, because you're right. When you talk about, when I'm saying local control, I don't mean the states' right arguments that we heard in the past.
Right.
But you're absolutely right. There's that balance, kind of like with the firefighter example. They had the control over they had a set of choices over where to invest as long as they met the standard. And the basic standard was, do you meet your obligations? And I think that, again, local control works best when you also have the basic standards of fairness and equity. All of those things have to be givens. So you have control, but the control doesn't go beyond what our basic shared values of fairness and justice and equity. Those have to be part of it. So it's a good thing. It's at what point where does local control end? Local control ends when you violate a value like equity. It ends there. If you're using your control to keep people out, now you don't get that, because that is not a standard that we can hold. And that's when we look at any issue and people say, can somebody make this decision? Well, here are the standards. Here are the limits. And here are the rights, and we balance all those out. But you're right. You can't have local control without also having standards. And again, that particularly fairness, equity standards are really key in that debate.
I think the key, and this conversation is so important, is that we need to talk more and to be with each other more. Diana can remember when we were doing these programs at the beginning, when we were at Lucille's Kitchen in North Minneapolis. And one of the stellar collaborations was one that involved our program the used to be called the Insight KMOJ Public Policy Forum
Mhm.
before it became Conversations with Al McFarlane. But we were in partnership with Minnesota Public Radio, with the Star Tribune, and I think with TPT2. And what we did was a couple of phenomenal conversations between people here in North Minneapolis on the ground and people in Crookston, Minnesota. And we set up two panels that could see each other and talk to each other and express, their opportunity, their frustration, the fact that both communities felt marginalized all kinds of ways. And what we discovered, I believe, and Diana, you can respond to this or add to it, was that some of the people in Crookston felt that, the Black folks have it made in the city. And maybe some people in the city felt that the whole world was rising and setting according to the whims of urban rural people. But both groups were experiencing a certain disadvantaging by systems that marginalized them both. We had more in common than we had dividing us. And so these conversations are critical. Diana, you remember that? Do you remember the expression?
Yeah, I think I was just getting ready to say it was shocking when we kind of got together and did this because, we were saying, well, does that really happen there? But that does happen here, And so, yeah, it was shocking. And we found out a lot that we had a lot in common, more so than we didn't know that we had in common. And like you said, this was rural area and that's not common. You know what I mean?
I was really right along that vein is one of the programs I'm most proud of is that when I came in, I saw that, we have the State of the Union, the president gets to talk about the U.S., and we have the state of the state, the governor gets to talk about the state, but where's the local issue? So since we work with local government and we collect so much local government data, we decided to do the state of Main Street. So each year we take our county, city, and township reports, we pull them together, put the trends together, and then invite the community in to say, tell us what this means to you. Graphs, I can live with graphs all day, but they don't mean anything until you hear from someone who lives that line going up or down, right? And so we had this series of listening sessions around the state over the last 3 years. And what's been fascinating is when you hear those moments of connection, not everyone talks about housing in the same way. Sure, they might talk about workforce housing in greater Minnesota. They may be talking about how do we find deeply affordable housing in the metro and shift people from encampments. But it is still housing that they're talking about. It's all ice cream, just different flavors, right? But it is something that brings us together. We would hear, I remember going up north and they would say, well, what people don't understand in the cities is that we have a bunch of property that the state owns, so it's off our tax rolls. Then we went to St. Paul and they said, what people in greater Minnesota doesn't understand that everything at the Capitol, that's not on our tax rolls, that's owned by the state. And so you can get big concepts like housing that we share, but even sometimes really small concepts like your tax base. And so I think you're right, the opportunities we have to talk about those things, there's so much we have in common. And if we could see things as basically more like customization than division. Again, different housing approaches around the state are not division. It is local governments finding ways to customize things to their particular population. That is a good thing. We should be concerned if everything was the same, right? So I think we have to be aware that we shouldn't assume that every time we see a difference that it's division. It may simply be customization, and that may be a good thing.
Julie, I know you have to leave shortly, but I want to make sure you have time to ask for the vote. This is about what's coming up in November. So, yeah, as you would like to, please talk to our audiences about supporting you. I want to also, though, have you close up by shifting the conversation a bit, because I'm just curious as to how you, in the middle of public life and service, are ingesting all of the startling things happening at the national level. I think everybody I know is glued to the outflow of January 6th, the search of the Mar-a-Lago properties of former President Donald Trump. And what does it mean? And I keep hearing more and more talk and people trying to not over talk it, but the words, civil war are coming up more than you or I want to hear them come up. And we know that there were specific threats against federal law enforcement officers. So you can't say, oh, it's just an outlier. There is a wellspring, a monitorable wellspring of animosity and hatred. And so what does that mean for our country from your point of view? Not so much Minnesota, but if you have feelings about it here, great. But just what's your general thought, and how do you see, as a a public servant, we need to work together to ensure safety and the rule of law and democracy and more inclusivity, more freedom, and less narrow-mindedness. So those are general things, and take that any way you want to. Talk about any of it that you want to, but also talk about voting for you this November.
Well, this is the exact really right conversation for a group that's focused on a neighborhood, right? The idea that you are working in community with your neighbors. One of the things I would tell people when things get really tough is just saying, you know what, if it's tough for you to look at what's happening at the federal level, if you're frustrated what you're seeing state level, go local. There are wonderful things happening in your community. And if you see them, that is going to restore your hope. So I think the first step is look local. And realize that as tough as this is, and it is tough, and it's real, and it's a concern you should take seriously, but get your hope first. Look at what's happening locally that you can be proud of, that you can be excited about, that you can be connected to. Start there. Then let's talk.
You use the phrase "get your hope first." Is that what you
Yeah,
said?
get your hope first. Get your hope first. Get your hope first, and then go out. It's like we don't, you put your coat on before you go outside in the winter. Same thing. Get your hope on before you go out into the storm.
That's a good headline. That's a good headline. I like that.
And then as we go out there, look for the people who truly want to build connections, not division. There is a very real difference in this election between people like me who are running and a MAGA Republican. They're very deeply different. And we have to be honest about that. It's not always fun as a Minnesotan to call it out, but I'll tell you, I have an opponent that has a Republican opponent whose focus has been on undermining the institutions, not oversight for the sake of strengthening or building up, but simply as a state, the way to undermine so they can pull the power back to fewer people. You can't, that's not work. It doesn't work. It's not right. And it's also not effective to run a state. So you have to be very clear that, this extremism that you're feeling is real. And, but we absolutely can push back. And you may say to yourself, okay, I'm thinking about that with governor. I'm thinking about that with attorney general. I've got Ellison's back. That's where I'm going to solve it. I'm going to make sure we get Steve Simon back in so we actually can keep our #1 voting status. We all have access to the vote. Tim and Peggy, we need them back to make sure something actually gets done in the through the legislature. All those things are important, but so is your state auditor, because if extremism gets a foothold anywhere, it can take over everywhere. So you have to watch. For instance, my Republican opponent calls himself a Trump election lawyer, and in fact bragged about chasing an election judge around town in 2020. He got in a car chase with a guy simply trying to drop off his ballot box, and he was bragging about this. In fact, he filed a police report on this election judge, illegal, and my opponent still was calling him out for making this mistake. That is not what a state auditor does. You cannot provide oversight without being dedicated to the success of the people or the entities that you are overseeing. And in fact, if you don't do both, you can't do either. You have to be dedicated to their success. So look for people who want to see you be successful. And honestly, when you judge the auditor, it doesn't really even matter what I believe. What matters is that I believe in you. I believe that people in community can make good decisions, and they need the power to do that. And my job is to protect that power and your freedom to make those choices with your neighbors in community. And that is why I would love to have your vote, and I would be honored to continue to serve you.
How close was your election last year? Your first term?
Here's an interesting thing. I did get more votes than any other auditor in Minnesota history. But it's important to note that that the person who got the second highest number of votes in Minnesota history was my Republican opponent. And though it was a significant win, This year, I also have two candidates who are from marijuana parties. I have two different marijuana candidates on the ballot, neither of whom are running a campaign, neither of whom seem to actually be interested in the job. And I would say, this is not a time for a single issue, for anybody to be voting on a single issue, right? We've got to have somebody who is absolutely dedicated to this, that's not running to simply push a personal agenda. They're not running to simply try to get major party status and a refund from the state for a political party. You need someone who actually is absolutely invested in the success of local government and making sure people can succeed and have real choices in their community. And so I think people have to take this seriously, because and my Republican opponent, I should also add, has already put $80,000 of his own money into the campaign. He hasn't spent anything he's raised, because he's already put in $80,000, more than most people in Minnesota make in a year. He has dropped into this campaign. And so, you know what? We may not have as much money as him. But you know what? I think we have more people. We have people who are really dedicated to it and people who are focused on this job. So it's really important to say, in this race, I believe I'm the one who truly, truly wants to see Minnesota succeed. And that's why you need to send me back to St. Paul next year.
The issue of the Supreme Court decision against Roe v. Wade, how does it show up? A lot of the discussion was that even some of the moderate Republicans, because they feel personally threatened by the environment and the attitude, the impetus for that decision, might move toward the center, to find candidates that express their shared value of women's voices and women's rights. Do you see that happening as something that will impact your race or state races?
Well, yeah, I think it needs to. I think we have to be clear that it's surprising big issues like personal freedom, and there isn't much more local control than over your own body, over your own identity, over any of those things. So those things do come to play, and most people think, oh, well, that's not an auditor's role. But here's the thing. In Minnesota, in Minnesota, so much of our healthcare is connected to our counties. Our counties administer most of our safety net. Local government has very direct connections to healthcare. Abortion is healthcare. So if abortion is healthcare, you need somebody in the auditor's office that understands that. Because if a local government wants to ensure that abortion care is available to its citizens, you need an auditor who's going to look at that fairly and say, yes, since abortion is healthcare, there's a public purpose there. Somebody who is anti-abortion, somebody who's anti-choice, somebody who's anti-fair healthcare, complete healthcare for women in particular, is going to could get in the way of that in the auditor's office. So that is an issue that's going to show up and down the ballot because of its connection to healthcare. So it's a fair question to ask anybody who might make a decision on healthcare. Do you understand that abortion is healthcare, and are you going to protect that? Because that's going to be important up and down the ticket.
Julie, thank you so much for spending time with us. I want to invite you back between now and the election, because I'd love to get your take on, what our executive branch is doing to support safety, to support home ownership and wealth creation, to support increased educational opportunity. And there's so many more things that we can and should do. The last thing I would have you talk about was the $10 billion surplus. And you didn't talk directly about that, but I think you alluded to the fact that there's some common sense things that the administration wanted to do, but that have been blocked by the Republicans. And to what end? And so what are your thoughts about that? And you can sign off with that. I'll keep asking you questions all day. So
I could stay all day. These are the exact right questions, though. It's so good to have a connection about these things that matter to people. And I think that on the surplus, and though I can speak to it in different areas that I work, one of the other roles that I have as state auditor is that I serve on the Minnesota Housing Finance Authority. And so that's really key. This is money where we try to help ensure that housing is something that's available to everyone in Minnesota. And what we saw with, for instance, rent help went through the Housing Authority. And for all the discussion about rent help, and for all the discussion about when rent help ran out. Now, here's the thing. We knew that money was finite. We knew that that money was never going to cover everything, and it ran out. And we saw so many, again, some of those MAGA Republicans who were upset with the housing authority for the money running out, when it's like, whoa, you have a surplus here. You know, when everyone started getting so concerned about that, that's a great signal to say, wow, here is something that we learned from COVID that works. And instead of blaming people for it ending, what we should be saying is, well, how do we make this permanent? How do we build a structure that can help people and keep rents stable, right? And so as we're going through, there were things that the legislature had agreed to do. And yet we had, because there were, again, these are primarily MAGA Republicans that were so invested in division, they let that fall. And as a result, what you hear people in local government, particularly in the metro area, saying, we are concerned that when the COVID money runs out, we've got this cliff. And you know what? We can't fall off that cliff. We were using COVID money not just for COVID, but for things that we should always have. Right. You know, we were able to see what happens when we can fund the things we've always needed. And let's learn from that and do that. So to have a $10 million surplus when you have people living in tents and encampments is obscene. It is obscene. It doesn't have to be this way. In fact, legislators could still come back. They still could come back and fix this right now. And you know, any legislator that's running for office that's not willing to come in, keep their promises, get things done, and use that surplus in the way Minnesotans want it used, doesn't deserve your vote. So ask them, how would you get things done with that surplus? It tells you a lot about a legislator.
What is your power as auditor relative to the power of the governor, lieutenant governor, relative to the power of the attorney general? You mentioned that you collaborate, I think, in calling attention to or supporting investigations or activity, particularly of the attorney general. But describe that. You are, is it the three of you are the state's primary constitutional officers, right? Used to be, four of you.
Five of us. We can't. Governor, lieutenant governor, governor, secretary of state, attorney general, state auditor. We are your constitutional officers. We're your executive committee, and as executive council, excuse me. As executive council, we make a number of decisions together. We are co-equals. Now, I have to say, when I'm hanging out with the governor, it doesn't always feel exactly co-equal, but I'd like to remind Governor Walz about that all the time. He loves that. And mostly I like that when when Lieutenant Governor Flanagan reminds everybody she's a co-equal too. Anyway, so one of the things, you know, during COVID, for instance, any executive order that had to go beyond 5 days needed to be approved by the whole executive council. So when people talk about the actions we had to take during COVID, it was again, the governor, lieutenant governor led on that, but then Attorney General, I'll say Steve Keefe and I, how we talk, right? You know, this is a great group to work with. And so our job was then to take our unique lenses to take a look at that. I would look at how the finances line up. Keith looks at the legality. Steve looks at the equity. And so we would all look at it with our own lens to bring that together. So we worked a lot as a team. What I loved the most about working with that group was working with a group that was all about simply getting things done. They believed in science, and they also were willing to be humble and learn from mistakes and change course if needed. That's the kind of executive council that you need in tough times. You need them in good times too. But this is why, you know, I want to go back and do this work again and keep doing this work. And I want to go back with this team. Governor Walz, Lieutenant Governor Flanagan, Secretary of State Simon, and Attorney General Ellison, and I, your Auditor Blaha. We are a team. We going back together will be even more effective.
Julie, thank you so very, very much. Good luck. Wishing you success in your campaign, your effort to be returned as the state auditor. Diana, Dee, Brenda, before I let her go, any questions, comments, thoughts before we wrap this interview up?
I just want to say good luck, my friend. I just want to say good luck, my friend, and it's good seeing you again.
Good seeing you.
Brenda, you had a question or comment?
Yeah, we probably don't have enough time, but I was sitting up here being curious about how the state auditor's office looks at funding for public schools?
Mm-hmm. Again, it's part of the local government oversight section. One of the things that I noticed when I got into this office was that our office hadn't done a school audit in over 20 years. Now,
Wow.
that's what we called it, a petition audit. Now, these audits are getting done. Let's be clear. They're being done by private firms, right? So they are happening. What I wanted to make sure, though, is that we were still staying current with our skills on that. And so one of the things I was able to start building was a school team. Now, with COVID, we had to put our focus on the CARES Act money, the ARPA money, some of the federal money. But our next step then is to take and expand that team. For instance, we were able to do an audit. The community of Robbinsdale asked us to do an audit. So we did an audit on the Robbinsdale schools. And this is one reason why I think it was lucky that as an educator, I was coming into this. Because school finance, as we know, there isn't much more complicated in the world. I would rather try to build a space shuttle than to explain some of the funding structures in school finance. It's really intense. But one of the things that, people were concerned, they said they were concerned about fraud at Robbinsdale Public Schools. And, when you do an audit, audits can be, if they're left to be too complicated, people could read them any way they want. They're kind of a Rorschach test. If you want to be mad, you can say that this is why it's terrible. If you want to be, happy about it, you can say why it's good. You really need an audit that's going to provide the proper context. Mm-hmm. I also knew that here we were in a community that had their first African-American superintendent. Mm-hmm. And it was clear that some of this ask was coming out from a racist place. And we had to just own that and say, here's the thing, we're going to give you the honest truth. And we're going to make sure that nobody can misrepresent our data to say that something is happening that isn't. So not only did we provide the response, we also provided the context to say, this is not fraud. We are not seeing widespread fraud. What the accusations are unfounded. And it was important to come out and say that, because if we'd simply just left it at a bare report, people would have misused that. So it's important to have somebody in there that has a sense of the fact that disparity, that racism, sexism, ableism, all of that can show up anywhere. It's everywhere. So it's everywhere. Yeah. So so often I hear people say, oh, you're lucky. It's just the numbers. You don't have to worry about bias. Oh, you really have to worry about bias in the numbers, because it's easy to hide them, because people can say, well, that's just what the numbers say. No, you have to be very thorough. You have to be really vigilant for bias. You have to be very careful in how you explain it. And so with schools, our roles are generally at this point primarily with the investigations or audits, occasional audits in places where there's some controversy. But ideally, in the next term, I want to continue to expand that so that we're doing more audits in a more regular fashion. And this way, right now, if the auditor comes into a school district, you assume there's a problem. That's challenging, because you don't want anybody to have a preconceived notion. But if we're doing more regular audits where we're able to provide regular, just ongoing, run-of-the-mill, nothing, just everyday audits, I think that helps us not only understand things better, but also makes people understand our results better.
Does audit include systems, or is it just money? When you say audit, are you thinking only dollars, or do you think about efficiencies, about processes?
There's a couple different kinds of audits that you can do. A lot of people are familiar with our legislative auditor, and the legislative auditor in Minnesota works for the legislature. They're often doing what are called performance audits. They're checking like an idea. The people who made the decision want someone to check to see if their decision worked the way they expected. So they can have some more qualitative, sometimes more subjective audits about the quality of a decision. Our job is to look at, we're not judging the quality of the decision as much as, is the decision what you said it was going to be? Is it to the standards? Is it to the law? And we check not only to make sure your financial statements are fair, that they are honest and they are complete, but we also check to make sure, do you have the controls to prevent fraud? Do you have the controls to catch mistakes? We also check legal compliance. Here are we have a set of laws, and can you demonstrate that you are following the laws that pertain to you? So our audits are internal controls, financial statements, as well as legal compliance. That's the main parts of our audits.
Okay, great. This has been a wonderful conversation with you, Julie, State Auditor Julie Blaha. Thank you so much. And let me just remind people, the decision is yours. It's ours. And we have a duty. We have an obligation to show up and to speak up and to make sure that we co-create the kind of community and governance that reflects and supports our interests, our values, and the beauty we expect to continue to move towards and be within. Julie, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. I'd be so honored for your vote, and thank you for running my website. So if anyone has a question, wants me to call them directly, I would love to talk with you. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We'll see you. And we'll get you back before the November election, okay?
Terrific.
So Diana and Dee, Brenda, what do you think? It was a good conversation. Excellent conversation. I learned a lot just in talking to the auditor. Brenda, what do you think?
Her energy, I just loved it. And I love the story of her mother, build a bridge. Oh my goodness. No, she was really good, but who doesn't show up with everything on Mondays?
Julie's one of my political caucus sisters. So, when I was doing the caucus, this is how I know all of these people. And now they're running. So it's good to see this. You know what I mean? I think, Dee, you want to say something?
No, I was impressed with, like Brenda said, her enthusiasm and her energy. But I think it is a reminder for all of us. Number one, women can be very effective given the chance. And number two, we all need to get out and vote and pay attention to who's running. It's so important.
The education, not just in Minnesota, but nationwide.
Absolutely.
What I was thinking about, and I've raised this question in previous other shows, but the question of how things have been set up, the institutional coziness or arrangements that people can say, oh, that's just the way it is, but the default to that's just the way it is a default that excludes or shortchanges certain elements of the community, people of color in particular. So we end up needing to, having to question, to criticize, to challenge, and to push for change and reform so that our voices are heard, so that our lives, as we say, Black lives matter. And so I was thinking about, the fact that she said she was a machinist as a kid. I'm just totally impressed because it made me remember Brenda being a butcher in my dad's grocery store at the age of 12. I was handling equipment and machines and serving people as a 12-year-old. And so what I thought as she was speaking is that, her dad had the vision to say, you, my daughter, can machine like everybody else can, right? And you have a duty and obligation to do this at the same level of excellence because it's our family business, right? And that kind of thing speaks to the future that we have to have, where each and every one of us is accorded, expected to develop all of our capabilities, our interests, and that where none of us is sidelined or channeled because a person is a girl or a boy or, Black or Asian or Latino, and where the voice of it's not a question of the patriarch saying it's my way or the highway. There's got to be a shared ability to collaborate, to create understanding that really values the input of all members of the family, all members of the neighborhood, all members of the community, the society. And I think that's the feeling I got from her. I don't know, how did you see that, Brenda or Diana or Dee?
Al, you have to look at the foundation that you had, though. You had an entrepreneur who Black men at that time were not thinking a whole lot about owning businesses and things like that. And then you had a mother who was an activist.
Mm-hmm.
And so you had this combination that solidified this foundation that the Santa Fe place gave us.
Mm.
And, and I also think about Charles Caldwell. Look at what this magnificent artist did with his family. And now we're in the third generation. I don't know how old the grandson is, but I keep thinking about that picture and those paintbrushes and how this is just passed down. And look at all of the talent and the success that your parents gave all of you. Wayne and Micah just blew my mind. There and it's in them. Of course, it's been in you with 40 years of what you succeeded with against all odds. But it was that family. It was that unit. And we had that. So, and Caldwell, that's just, you got a daughter making shoes, designing shoes, and getting all these unbelievable awards. And, that's the beauty of it. My parents didn't have education, but my God, if my father drove in from his third job and came up that driveway and the light in my study was not on, I would hear about it because that foundation came first. And we're losing kids, we're losing teachers. I'm just going to continue to fight.
Yeah.
And continue to write about it and be grateful for the privilege of doing it. And by the way, Diane, I don't know if you know, I have a mentor in Sean Lewis, and that young man has taught me, well, between the evolving senior with you, Seth, Al had mentioned about a story today on the Hiawatha thing. And I know he was surprised when we said, excuse me, the mentor and the old lady started this at about 7:00 this morning because we're both up at 5:30 and 6:00 working. And so it was like, well, I guess I better come up with another subject because they're already on it. But it was so important.
That's Sean, though, because sometimes I get my first email at 4:00 from Sean.
Oh,
so
I know.
He's ready.
I asked him, I said, my boss doesn't sleep, but do you? Never. I love it, though. I've learned so much from that young man.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden we said, and he had been sending these emails on Hiawatha's golf course. So I had to start doing this research. And then at 5:30, 6:00 this morning, he sends me this press release. And I said, okay, Al, we'll have it this afternoon. We got it. We're on it. Love you, boss.
Diana, what do you think? We got a couple of minutes here. We're actually out of time, but
I'll let Dee have the last say.
Dee?
Well, after listening to Julie, I think the best thing that any of us can do for our kids and our grandkids is to teach them to say why. As you say, Al, this is the way it's always been, is the quote. Then my response and my kids' response and my grandkids' response should be why. Because it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah.
I told you, Diana, she very seldom says anything, but when she says it, it's like power.
I know. That's why I let her have this last word.
Always something, because I never will forget when Dee said, it doesn't happen to my kids. It wouldn't happen to my kids. And I got off the air and I said, oh, if people only knew what it took for a single mother to raise 2 Black kids in all white schools.
Yeah,
You know, it was a great program. I love Julie's energy.
Yes, I'm very impressed.
Yeah, very much.
Listen, guys, great job. Great to see you again. We'll see you again this time next week for this program, but we're here every day at 1 o'clock. So hopefully you see us tomorrow. We want to get more people who are checking us out on YouTube and Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter to weigh in as well. So if you are connecting with us in either of those platforms, come on and say your name and say where you're watching from, where you're tuning in from, so we can acknowledge you. We thank you for your interest, your presence. We want you to like and support and subscribe to us any way you can. And we want you to live effective lives in our community, in our country. I'm Al McFarlane. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.